forth to Rwanda for 7 or 8 years, and have some precious sisters like Baraka and Josephine as a result. And I find Rwandans to be very gracious and warm and people with a lot of courage who, after terrible things have happened, are fighting hard to make life good in Rwanda for everyone. And so it's a privilege for me to know you and to be here today. I am a psychologist, and I have worked with trauma for 38 years, which is a long time, and with all different kinds. And so what I'm going to do this morning, you worked with your groups and with Baraka to have a definition of trauma. I want to give you the big picture of what healing would look like.
Yeah.
And then as we go through the rest of the conference, the other workshops will be going deeper into the big picture. So I will mention things, and then tomorrow and the next day, we will really go down into them to give you a chance to practice them and understand how to do the things I'm talking about today. We're also going to end the conference on Friday with ways for you to take care of yourself. Because you are the ones who are doing the caregiving, but you also need caregiving. And you want to last for a long time in the work that you're doing. And so we'll, on Friday, talk about how to care for the caregiver so that you can endure what you do. Okay? So what I'm going to talk about today is how to live with traumatic memories. And any of you who have trauma memories know that you really don't want to live with them, you just want them to go away. But, or if you can't forget them and make them disappear, you would at least like to not have to think about them. But if you have trauma in your life, you know the experience also of trying to sort of hide it from yourself, so you don't have to think about it. And then something happens and it breaks through and there it is again. So you can't get rid of it. This is a quote from somebody who was traumatized. And she said this: "I live beside it. It is always there, fixed and wrapped in the tough skin of memory. It's separate from my present day me. I want the skin to be tougher, because I don't want the trauma to spill out all over my life. It's like another skin beneath the skin that I have. You have one vision of life, but because I've been traumatized, I have two. I have the trauma, and I have my life today. And I don't want the trauma to reach out and grab my life today." So this person describes a very common experience. She's trying hard to forget or hide the memory from herself, but she's always afraid that it will grab her, because you cannot erase trauma memories. You cannot make them go away. There's a quote from a psychologist who says this: "What cannot be talked about can also not be put to rest. And if it is not, the wounds continue from generation to generation." And I know you're already seeing that the children who have even been born since the genocide struggle with trauma because their parents have not been able to manage their own trauma. And so the children get traumatized by their parents' experience. So if we don't learn how to live with trauma memories in a healthy way, we keep passing them down in the generations. And I know that's not what you want for Rwanda. Trauma memories will not disappear from our minds, because our brains are made in a way not to forget anything. It's all in there. Sometimes we can't find it. You know, you want to remember something and you can't find it, but everything is in there. So since we cannot erase them, then we must learn how to live with them so they do not poison us. So what I want to do is focus on the things that help us live with trauma memories and honor them as real events, and yet still be able to live today in strong and creative ways. So the first thing I'm going to talk about are 3 ways that human beings can respond to their own trauma memories or those of someone you're caring about so that it helps them toward recovery. So we're going to talk about 3 things about that. And then the second part are another 3 ways for people who have been traumatized to help themselves toward recovery. So the first part are the 3 ways you can help them, and the second part are the 3 ways they can help themselves to get stronger. Every time a human being experiences trauma, they are faced with making a sorrowful and heartbreaking adjustment to a different life than the one they had before. They can't get back the life they had before, and they have to adjust to the new life that includes the trauma. Trauma, and we talked about this in the groups and with Baraka this morning, trauma involves an event that threatens our life or safety. Trauma takes away choice. Nobody chooses to be traumatized, okay? It's something that you're helpless to stop, and it overwhelms you. So it takes away choice, which is very important to people, and it results in the kind of fear that makes us feel like we're drowning in it. Trauma includes things like war, and violence, and rape, and sexual abuse, physical abuse, and genocide. Human beings who are traumatized feel alone in their experience. They feel helpless. They feel humiliated. And they feel hopeless. Following trauma, people turn in toward themselves because they're trying to think about what happened and how to carry it and how they feel about it and how to express it. So they're turning things inward in order to try and manage it. That is not wrong. It is necessary for a while for healing. But eventually, if the person is to live life, they must turn back out toward life here in a way that is good. So when we look at recovery from the experience of trauma, what we're trying to do is help people in a way that reverses what the trauma did. So, for example, trauma takes away choice. When you're caregiving with a trauma survivor, you want them to have choice in the process. Do you want to talk about that today? Do you need to stop now? Do you want to keep talking? All of those things give people dignity because it gives them choice. So recovery is a way of treating people differently than the trauma treated them. Trauma often brings silence because you know that our ordinary language words don't really fully express what it's like to be traumatized. You can put it into words, people can understand your words, but it's not the same as having lived it. Words are never the same as living something. Trauma brings a sense of emotional darkness and despair. It feels sometimes like either no one cares or nobody could ever understand what it was really like. Trauma seems to make time stand still. And I'm sure you've worked with people who stay in the same place emotionally even for years. They're stuck. Because people get so overwhelmed by the trauma, they lose hope and they cannot see anything for their future. They feel like their future is gone. So there are 3 things that need to occur in order for people to begin to recover from trauma. And these 3 things affect what trauma does to us. All 3 of them have to happen. If just 1 or 2 happens, recovery will not occur. So we need all 3 of them. And the 3 things are this: talking, tears, and time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those things. But anybody who is going to recover from trauma needs talking, tears, and time. Now, how many of you in this room know how to talk? Can you talk? Yes, everybody knows how to talk, right? Does anybody know somebody who has not talked about trauma because they can't do it yet? You met people like that? Well, talking, of course, is part of being human, isn't it? It's how God made us. He meant for us to talk. He meant for us to talk to each other so that we can get to know and understand each other. He meant for us to talk with Him. So talking is very important. When somebody does not talk, something is broken. So if there's a stuck place for somebody and no words come, something in them is broken. There may be something physically wrong, like if my voice goes away today, or they may be emotionally wounded from a traumatic experience that makes them unable to talk. Sometimes when people do not talk at all, or do not talk about a particular traumatic event, it is because the pain inside is so big, they cannot find words to tell you what it's like. And so they don't even try. Sometimes people talk all the time about trauma, but they just keep saying the same things over and over and over again, and there's no recovery in it. All right? So people can not talk, or people can talk too much. There's a proverb in Rwanda that says this: a hoe cannot be damaged by a stone that is exposed. You know that proverb?
Yes.
That's a very good trauma proverb. Because what it's saying is that when you're working in the field and you bring your hoe down, if there's a rock there you didn't see, you can break your hoe. But if the ground has been cleared and you know where the rocks are, you don't hit them with your hoe. Well, trauma is like that. It can be inside of us, and if we don't pay attention to it or find a way to help it heal and help us recover, our hoe, our way of doing life, is always going to be banging into that rock and getting damaged. And so trauma is about talking so we can expose the rocks, so they aren't stuck in here with nothing happening to them. So talking, when somebody's traumatized, talking is necessary. They must eventually talk about it. Words will not be enough. They will never fully express it, but they must be spoken. Talking is a way of honoring the memory. It's a way of saying it was real and true, and it's a way of saying how it hurt you, because you matter. So there's something honoring about talking. It also means you're speaking truth and not living in denial. So if you have trauma in your life, you honor yourself and your memory by speaking the truth about what's there. It involves saying what happened was really evil. It was not good. It involves saying it did damage to me and my family and my nation. It dishonors victims when we encourage them to be silent. It is not good for them when we want them to pretend, or we say trauma is not that important. We are doing more damage to somebody who's already been traumatized. Talking about the trauma is a way of saying to the world, see me, do you see me? This is who I am, and this is what happened to me, and this is how I feel about it. And we honor people when we listen to their stories. It's a way of saying I was damaged by injustice, or violence, or whatever. It is a way of bringing my broken heart out into the light a little bit so it can be cared for by other people who are safe. Now sometimes when people have been traumatized, they don't have words right away. And so I'm sure you've sat with people who just sigh, or they cry, or sometimes they moan and curl up in on themselves. Those are the beginnings of their story. They don't have real words yet, but those sounds are the beginning of words. And so when we sit with people and honor those things without words, we are helping them and waiting with them so that they can find words. And eventually words must come. And sometimes we need to help people find words. And so sometimes when I work with somebody who's been traumatized, I will ask them to describe something about how they feel about what happened, and they won't have a word. And so I'll say, well, what about fear? Or what about hopeless? Or what about drowning? And so I will offer them words, and then they will reach out and say, yes, that's the right word right there. Then I can say, tell me a little bit more about your fear. So we assist them in finding words. Little by little, they find words until the words go together and they give you pieces of their story. So we have words building, then we have pieces of the story, and then eventually they can tell the whole story. So that's what it looks like. Talking is about telling the truth. And when you sit with somebody who's been traumatized and they tell you the truth, they have taken the part of themselves that hurts the most and connected it to somebody who cares. And that is a step toward recovery. It gives them a choice. It restores dignity because you're willing to listen to them and honor them. It is a reversal of what happened. Injustice, violence, and abuse teach human being lies. We want the story and the truth to come out so we can begin to help them know truth rather than lies. So as you know, when a violent act happens to somebody, they feel like they do not matter, like they're worthless. When you listen to the story, you are giving them worth back. So you're restoring the things that the trauma took. Violence and abuse disconnect us from other human beings because the world is not safe, and so we retreat. And so telling the story connects again. When you listen to someone's story and the work that you do, you are giving them dignity, you are giving them honor, you are helping to restore what happened to them. So trauma recovery requires talking. Trauma recovery requires tears. That's the second thing. So how many of you have ever shed tears? Yes? Everybody knows what tears are like. Or how many of you have had the experience of wanting to cry but you couldn't cry? It felt like it got stuck inside. Trauma recovery requires tears because facing a different world after the terrible thing that happened brings great grief to our hearts. And so we need to express that grief. Trauma brings fear and aloneness and sadness, humiliation, anger, and grief. These are strong emotions that people have after trauma, and they are hard to experience. They're emotions none of us want. I mean, nobody wants to be afraid. Nobody wants to be full of despair. We would rather not have those feelings, but like words, the emotions need to be expressed. If somebody just tells the story and has no feelings, they will not recover. And if somebody has feelings, and never puts it into words, they will not recover. You need both of those things. For some people, words come first. For some people, feelings come first. Different personalities will react differently, but what you want to keep in mind as you care for people is that eventually both of those things need to happen. Somebody who does nothing but cry will not get better unless she or he can learn to tell the story. And somebody who talks, but it's like they have no feeling, they're just sort of flat, they will not recover either. They need to express the emotions. And again, talking and tears with you or somebody who's caring for them reconnects them back to human beings. Many trauma survivors are afraid to feel, and they will say things, and I've heard this many times from people, I can't start crying because if I start to cry, I will never stop. So many trauma survivors are very afraid of their emotions because they're so strong and they think that they will never come out of it. They will just stay stuck in those feelings. Sometimes people, in order not to feel those feelings, will do things like drink a lot of alcohol or use drugs. And what they're doing is trying to make the feelings that frighten them stay down inside. And so they use substances to do that and keep the memories away. But of course, if somebody, for example, is staying drunk all the time, so they do not have to remember and feel their feelings. It's the trauma that is controlling their lives. The very thing they want to heal from is still governing their lives. So when people medicate themselves like that with alcohol, the trauma is the one that rules, rather than the person beginning to make choices and express themselves and be in charge of their own lives. It is also very important for all of us to remember that when anybody is telling us their trauma story, when they're facing the truth and experiencing deep and painful emotions, that we're looking at somebody who's very courageous. When you sit with somebody who is telling you their own story, they have courage to do that, because they're facing the one thing they don't want to remember. And they're expressing feelings that they want to go away. And it takes a lot of courage to do that. Sometimes people cannot express feelings in words. And so I find sometimes working with trauma survivors, I have to use things that are not verbal. So people can sometimes paint you a picture, or they can compose a song about their sadness or something like that. Many years ago, I saw a woman who had been sexually abused a lot as a child, and she was a ballerina. And she loved to dance, but she could not tell me about the abuse in words when we first started meeting. And so I asked her to go home and make up a dance that would express what was in her heart. And she came back to see me, and she danced it out for me. And I could see her fear in the dance, and her sadness in the dance, and all of those things. And as she did that, we began to put words to the dance, and she was able to tell her story. So when people cannot speak, you look for ways other than words to help them begin that process. People could create symbolic jewelry that stands for something about the trauma. People have written plays and poems and all those kinds of things. You want to use the traditions in your culture to help people express pain before they find words. There's a verse in the book of Psalms in chapter 56 that says this: "You," and it's talking about God, "have taken account of my mourning, and you have put my tears in your bottle. Are they not also in your book?" It's a very important thing, because you see, sometimes when we listen to people, we're very uncomfortable with their feelings. Their feelings feel like they're going to overwhelm us too. Especially when the sorrow is so deep, or there's a lot of anger. Sometimes when we're caregivers, we get afraid of those things. And sometimes we are taught in our own cultures, or sometimes in churches and things like that, that feelings are bad, and you should not express them. Or that they are a sign of weakness. Or that it's okay for women to have feelings, but not men. Or it's okay for children to have feelings, but not adults. But this verse in the Psalms says that the God who made us considers our pain, and he pays such close attention to it that he collects our tears and puts them in a bottle. So if our God does that with people's pain, I think we ought to learn how to do that also. To listen to their emotions and help them with those feelings. Again, we honor them when we do that. And tears, just like talking about the trauma story, tears require strength and courage, because it means they are facing hard things. And again, many people will be afraid because they think they will lose control of themselves, because the emotions of trauma are so powerful. And dealing with those feelings takes time, and you help them try to do it little by little by little. And you help them learn how to express perhaps their fear, and then help them find something comforting to do after that. And then they express a little more fear, and then help them find something comforting. So you don't want to leave them like this open wound full of feelings and no ability to take care of themselves. You will find when you work with people who've been traumatized that sometimes they have one or two parts of the memory that are more vivid than any other part. And it's the part they keep going back to and telling over and over again. one of the things I have learned when I've listened to people is that when people have a memory, a part of a memory that they keep repeating again and again, there's something deeper going on. So for example, somebody may continue to tell the memory of seeing somebody die, and they tell it over and over and over again. And if you really explore with them, what you realize is that memory is not just about the death of the person, but it's also about the death of hope. Two things died at that moment. And so you're trying to help them understand what's under the memory that keeps them stuck there. It's not just what they witnessed or what happened to them, but it's about other things as well. One of the things that is very true about working with trauma is that people repeat things over and over again. It is a way of gaining control of the memory. And so they will tell you the story, and then they will tell you another way to look at it, and they will tell you the story again, or they will repeat this part of the story. It is very repetitious. They repeat, repeat, repeat. And we need to let them do that, because they are trying to learn how to carry the memory and still do life. And it's sort of like trying on some clothing, and they don't like the way it fits, so they throw it off. And then they try it on again. And they try it on again until eventually they can wear it and walk through life without it controlling them or destroying them. Sometimes they will keep saying, I can't believe this happened. Sometimes they will try to tell you that maybe it didn't happen. Maybe they made a mistake. They're constantly going back to the same part of the story repetitiously, trying to find a way to live with it. And again, it is a way of trying to master what mastered them. When we experience trauma, we are helpless. Repeating the story is a way of trying not to be helpless. When we experience the trauma, we are very close to death. Telling the truth to a caring person is a choice toward life. So again, as you sit with them and honor them in their story, you are helping them choose life. Now there's a third thing that has to require. The first one is talking. The second one is tears. The third one is time. Now unfortunately, we don't have any control over that one, right? We can't make the day go faster or slower. Time just happens. But trauma recovery needs talking, tears, and time. It must have all three. You can talk about it and you can cry about it, but it's not going to be all better in a day, right? It takes a long time for that to happen. And so time has to pass, so people are not so controlled. It must be spoken over and over again, the story. It must be, the emotions must be expressed over and over again, honoring the victim. The tears express the feelings that make nightmares. The tears express the feelings that keep people hiding in their houses. And so it's very important that the tears happen, but it's important that the talking and the tears happen over time. In many ways, when a trauma survivor is telling you their story and the feelings and impact that it had, it's almost like they're standing up after being knocked down, and they've got their hands on their legs, and they are looking at the trauma, and they are saying to the trauma, you will not own my life. I will tell your story. I will tell what you did to me, but you will not own my life. So that's what you're helping them to do, is stare it down, so it doesn't control their lives. It takes time for the words to come. It takes time to repeat them. It takes time for the feelings. Recovery from anything takes time. And if you fall down the steps out here and break a bone, you're not going to be better tomorrow, right? You have to go and get the bone set, and you have to wait for it to heal, and then when they take the cast off, your leg is weak, and you have to learn how to use it again. All of that takes time. So physical wounding takes time to recover, but so does heart wounding take time to recover. Time is needed, but it is not the same amount for every trauma survivor. Some people will heal faster than others. when people have good support systems and aren't worried about food and all those things, they may recover more strongly. Sometimes it depends on the level of the trauma that happened to them, but everybody needs time. And if we say to people, you should be over it by now, you should forgive and forget, and all of those things, we will do harm to them because it takes time for recovery. What happens over time, and we know this from research, is that when somebody's been traumatized, it's the biggest thing in their life. But as they talk and express feelings and time passes, it gets smaller in their life. It never goes away, but it's a piece rather than huge. And so you're helping them shrink it down so that the rest of their life comes in and they can move forward into the future. So they cannot erase it, but they can choose how to use it and where it should be in their life. So, what are the three things? Talking, tears, and time. And all three must happen for recovery. All right? Now, there's another phase of recovery, which also has three things in it. They don't all start with T, though. The talking and the tears and time are like instruments that the survivor can use toward their own healing. They choose to tell you the story. They choose to express the emotion. That's part of what restores dignity to people. They're not being forced to do this. They are making a choice, all right? The second phase of recovery, which has three things, is focused more on the future. When you're doing talking, tears, and time, you're looking at the past, yes? You're looking back at the trauma and saying what it was and how it hurt you. The second phase of recovery is looking this way, which you cannot do until you've done this. So they need to go through the talking, tears, and time, and then you will watch them begin to shift and begin to think about tomorrow or next year or whatever. So that's the second phase of recovery. You know, again, if you think about a broken leg, if you've just broken your leg and it hurts a lot, that's really pretty much all you think about, right? It hurts. You think about the pain. You think about trying to stop the pain. You think about all kinds of things around the pain. But once the bone begins to heal and it doesn't hurt so much, you think about other things. So that's what we're doing. We're looking at the past or the brokenness, and as we do that and begin to heal, then we can look ahead on how to walk again. So the three things are a caring relationship, purpose or work, and faith. Those are the three things that reconnect people back to life. So what do I mean by relationship? And we're going to talk about relationship and safe relationships and things later on in our time, these 3 days. But trauma shatters relationship. It destroys it. Because people are acting not like human beings, or they are betraying us, or they are abandoning us, or they are violating us. And so it makes us afraid of relationship. But eventually the trauma survivor has to decide whether to choose to try relationship again. And so that's one of the things that they're going to make a choice about. Now they've already made a small choice if they're telling you their story. They're trusting you to treat them with dignity, to hear their story, to care about them. So that's already a step towards relationship. You're the first relationship. And when you help them do that and are a safe person for them, that gives them the strength and courage to choose others to have a relationship with. Until eventually they can move back into their church or with their neighbors or in society in some way. They're no longer isolated. And again, trauma took away choice. They're choosing to talk to you, and then they're choosing relationship on the outside. We must all choose what kind of human being we're going to be. And as somebody is recovering from trauma, which is about evil and violence and death and darkness and all those things, there are little ways that they can fight against it. So you see, if a trauma survivor does something kind for someone else, they are choosing life. If they are helpful to someone else, they are choosing life. All of those little things, loving, kind, helpful things that human beings can do, Every time a trauma survivor does even the tiniest thing, they are reconnecting back to life, which helps them in their recovery. And again, what they're saying to the trauma is, you will not own me. You will not own me and make me so afraid I never talk to people again. You will not own me and make me hate people. I will choose how to learn to love people again. They can, little by little, as they do these little life things, like kindness or helpfulness, begin to build a life again that has relationship in it. Violence degrades us. It makes us feel shame and humiliation. Having the courage to be kind to someone fights against that and makes us feel human and stronger again. The second thing that has to happen, besides relationship, is purpose. And sometimes that's found in work. You know, if somebody has a job that they, in particular, if it's a job that they like, I'm sure you all have found purpose in the work that you do, caring for others. And so you want the people that you're helping to have a sense of purpose too. Quite a few years ago, I took a trip, it was actually with World Vision, to the Dominican Republic. And while we were there, we walked through the poorest section of the city. And one of the things I will never forget are the men who were sitting outside their doors with no expression on their face. They weren't doing anything, there was no life in their eyes. And it was because they could not provide for their families. And so they felt worthless. They had no purpose in life. And so people need to have a sense of purpose as they heal from trauma. Otherwise, they're going to continue to feel the shame and humiliation that the trauma brought to them. And again, it can be a job that pays a salary, but it doesn't have to be that. Cooking a meal, sharing bread with a neighbor, tending a garden, raising children, those are all very purposeful things that are good. And so as people begin to heal, they're going to have to name what gives them a sense of purpose and begin to do those things. And it will bring dignity to them as they continue to grow. You know, if you think about somebody even who creates things of beauty, like a basket or jewelry or something, I mean, part of what people are doing is saying, look, I did that. That came from me. Which is another way of fighting against the trauma, which tries to erase us and say you're not worth anything. But if you make something beautiful or you do something kind, you are saying, I am here and I did a good thing. So relationship and purpose. And then the last thing is faith. Trauma affects faith. Sometimes it destroys faith, yes? I am a Christian, and so I want to consider faith with you today from that perspective, as an agent of recovery. But I want to think of a couple things about trauma and faith before we do that. One is that trauma can destroy or hurt faith because we do not understand what God is allowing. And it is very frightening to trust a God who says he loves us but allows evil in this world. And we don't understand why that is. I don't understand it either. But when it happens, particularly, I know sometimes I've worked with people in the United States who have been traumatized by clergy, pastors. And so that's like a double hurt, because the trauma is a hurt, and then someone who says they are a man of God has done damage as well. And so it's very destructive to people's faith when that happens. Trauma stops faith oftentimes. It breaks it. And then we have to learn or choose whether to have faith again after the trauma. One of the things that happens when trauma does that is people begin to think about life based on the trauma, not based on the faith in God. So before the trauma, I might say, well, I will be kind to my neighbor because God has said I should be kind and I love God. After the trauma, you say, I don't want to go near my neighbor. I don't care what God says. I'm afraid of my neighbor. And so what happens is people begin to make decisions based on the trauma rather than on their faith, which is very understandable given what happened to them, okay? You think about, I'm sure you all know about the earthquake in China not so long ago, and the schools collapsed and many children died during that time. So you think about a couple, let's say, in China who are Christians and who lost a child because of the earthquake. The building collapsed and the child died. When they, some years later, go to take another child to school, what do you think they're going to feel? Are they going to have faith in God that the child will be all right? Or are they going to be afraid to leave the child in the school because the earthquake killed their other child? So you see how the trauma then begins to determine what we do and how we feel. They might choose not to take their child to school at all because of the trauma. So it's very hard after trauma to have faith in God. And sometimes when people are struggling with that, we give them a lot of judgment. You know, what's wrong with you? You should have faith in God and all of those things. But my experience is that when faith gets hurt like that, God is working. He's working in the brokenness of the faith. And He will eventually help build the faith in a stronger way over time. One of the things that God used, one of the primary things, of course, that He used to teach us about Himself is when He came in the flesh as a person, right? So He came as Jesus. And the Bible says that part of what He's saying there is, you want to understand who I am as God? This is what I look like walking around on the ground. This is who I am. And so it's very important for us, number one, as caregivers, to follow Jesus in ways that remind people of who God really is, that their suffering matters, that He wants to hear it, that He collects their tears in a bottle, and that He cared enough to come to this planet, this earth, which is so broken and has so much evil in it, in order to someday restore it. So first, when you work with somebody as a caregiver, you are God with skin. Okay? The way that we work as caregivers shows people the caring of God Himself in the flesh. The other thing is how to have faith in God Himself based on what He says about Himself. There's a man named Elie Wiesel, and he is a Jew, and he, at age 15, was put in one of the Nazi concentration camps, where he stayed for some years before the war was over. So he is a Jew, and he lived through genocide. And he said this, which I think is a very important thing for us to understand. He says, we should not think that it is comforting when people have been traumatized to tell them that God is still alive. He said that is not a solution. It is a problem. And it is a problem because if God is still alive, why did this happen? So he understands what trauma does to faith. And he says it is very difficult to take the reality, in his case, of the Nazi death camps and God and hold them together in my mind. You see, it makes sense if I think, okay, there's no God, but there were death camps. That makes sense. Or there is a God, but there are no death camps. It's the same thing, whether it's sexual violence, whether it's genocide, whether it's war trauma, whatever it is. How do you hold them together? You take a child who's been raped. How do you say, there is a God who loves us and there is a child rape? Now I can say there's no God and children get raped. That makes sense to my brain. Or I can say there is a loving God and there's no child rape. That makes sense to my brain. How do we put the two together? And that is the struggle of faith after trauma. How to put those together. The only response that I know to that problem is the cross of Jesus Christ. Because it is there that trauma and God come together. In the cross, where Jesus was crucified, he was traumatized. He was betrayed. He was humiliated. He was abandoned. He was beaten. He was cut. All of those things, right? So here we have God and trauma together. And it is from that place that resurrection comes. So the more we understand, I cannot answer why, I cannot say why God allows things like sexual violence or genocide or war, but I do know that he bore those things on himself at the cross. The scriptures tell us that. He bore our griefs, he bore our sorrows, he bore our sin and our evil. All of that is at the cross on God, and it is there that those things crash together and lead to resurrection. So that what we are doing as we pursue faith with people is helping them see God with wounds, like we have. He has wounds. He knows what it feels like to be wounded by evil. And he is with us in our wounds. He joined with us in our wounds. And he did that because he wants us to be full of his life now in this wounded world, reminding people of the wounded God, but also because he will resurrect it all someday and make all things new. He is going to take this world and make it into a world that has no genocide, that has no war, that has no sexual violence. And while we wait for him to do what he promised with those wounds, he has called us to serve him with wounded people, ourselves also wounded people, knowing that it will lead to the resurrection. I do not know, having sat with many people who have been traumatized by many different things, any other way to bring faith to a traumatized heart. Nothing else will answer except his wounds and his cross and the promise of life as we wait. Faith in God is hard when life is ordinary, yes? Faith in God seems impossible when terrible atrocities happen. It is a massive struggle. But you know, fighting with it, and we're going to talk about this more on Friday, and our own grieving over the wounds of ourselves, our families, our communities, our countries. You know, God calls us to grieve in front of him, but any struggle with faith is not to be degraded. It's not to be condemned. So you don't say to people, your faith is too small, what's the matter with you? The struggle with faith is a struggle that God honors. It is a good struggle, no matter how hard it is for somebody. They are struggling to understand God in their life after trauma. And as we come to understand that ourselves, we understand that as caregivers, we are called to bear his image in this world. We are called to look like him with each other and with the people that we care for, and bring his love and his presence and his faithfulness to them ourselves, so that they also can begin to bear the image of God in their own lives. And out of the wounds and the worst places in their lives, you will see life begin to be born that they can then carry out to other wounded people. God is alive. Sometimes it doesn't look like it, but he is alive, and he sits on his throne, and he is going to come one day and make everything new. The question for us is, what will we do with our lives while we wait for him?